Well, if you
Yeah.
want me to tell you about a project that I think encapsulates that, I have a good answer for that. Because as I think everybody knows, but the favorite building for me is the Management Institute in Bangalore, the one that Vastu Shilpa did, that Doshi and his office designed. It encapsulates for me what a wonderful tropical building is, what a building in India is. It is the kind of building that I think, when Charles Correa mentions something called deep structure, it's a building that whoever you take, and not only Indians, but foreign architects, uh, there is a kind of familiarity with what you experience there, which is unbelievable. Both familiarity, but also, just a complete sense of being alive, because of the kind of light and the kind of scales. It has this incredible, enjoyable sort of environment, which is very, very difficult. And it's the kind of environment that you encounter when you go to some of these great temple complexes or these great historical sites that move you in ways that a lot of modern architecture doesn't. And so I think the Management Institute in Bangalore is a great example for a truly local but also universal sort of piece of architecture that everybody connects to. Um, and but then I that doesn't mean that there is only one way to do it. There are lots of examples of great buildings at different scales that do the same thing. I think the message is that rather than going for identity, which today has become a really charged sort of thing, this idea of Indian and this idea of kind of a kind of a very strong identity. I think more importantly, we have to go back to how we are as human beings and how we relate to our senses, how we invigorate those senses through these exercises. And so you encounter architecture even abroad sometimes that moves you in ways that that great architecture does back home. So I wouldn't go down to saying that there is only one way to do Indian architecture. I think there are ways in which to create architecture, and that's to connect with the spirit and to connect with the senses and to sort of celebrate the human condition. There's a wonderful piece that Prem Chandavarkar has written recently on his personal blog, particularly about the Architects Act, and he talks about something called the aura of architecture, and this thing that you just asked me, about the great piece of architecture that you encounter, like the wonderful church that Korea did in Bombay, the Salvasau Church. It's a very small building, and yet it moves you in unimaginable ways. How do you go through 5 years of architecture and produce work like that? Are all of us equipped? And how come then, if an architectural degree is supposed to prepare you to make architecture, how come our cities are filled with buildings that have absolutely nothing to say and cannot move you in those profound ways? And so the question that Chandavarkar is asking really is that um, uh, does a 5 year degree, like an earlier question that you asked, does a 5 year degree really guarantee the production of the great artistic masterpiece, architecture that really moves you, or architecture that has an aura? And so, on the one hand, I mean, there is this, you grapple with the struggle on the one hand of how do you produce architecture and how do you get into, getting people excited and self-propelled so that they go out and find their own voice. And so I think architecture school should have that mandate, the mandate of igniting the interest in a student so that you're really sort of feeling the urge to get out there and discover that voice that you're searching for as a creative individual. And so if there's some way to structure an architectural course that allows you that freedom to discover those things that are important to you, but also to subtly guide you in the way that you're responsible socially and that you're responsible environmentally, but also charged so that you're constantly seeking and constantly learning. That's a wonderful mandate for an educational institute as the place to find ignition, the start of things. Yeah. No, so here, so just going through again in some detail, and I'm not an expert of the 1972 Act. I've kind of read it, in a very, very sort of quick way after this, big judgment was announced sometime in March. And what the Architects Act did in 1972 is it, of course, set up a statutory regulator, the Council of Architecture, which then had the ability to do two things. It had the ability uh, to monitor or to articulate how architectural education would be conducted in the country, and it also had a second responsibility of uh, how architects were licensed to practice. So there are these two arms of the Architects Act: one in terms of regulating education, and the other in terms of licensing. So that's all that the Architects Act was really trying to do, was to try to streamline what otherwise was kind of a bit of a messy condition, to say that okay, only one body can sort of monitor how education is conducted in the country, and how architects are registered to then practice. So what the Act does, what 1972 Act does, is that it gives only a person who's come out of a registered educational institution, one registered with the council, and subsequently registered with the I'm sorry, coming out of the college and registering with the council. Only that person can actually practice as an architect. Not practice, but he can call himself an architect. So the council, what the council does and what the Act protects is the title of the architect. It does not protect the practice of architecture. So it doesn't say that only a registered practitioner, only a registered architect with the council can practice architecture. It says anybody can practice architecture, but you cannot call yourself an architect. To call yourself an architect, you need to be registered with the council. So that's, in a very, very sort of broad way, what the Architects Act is set up to. See, it's not a simple answer, because of the fact that all of us, you included, Abhigna, all of us together, we're spending a lot of time in college studying to become architects. And the idea is that if I've gone to a good institution, I come out with a sort of range of skills which allows me a sophisticated way in which to engage with my clients, engage with the city, with the environment, socially, etc. So you're taking that as a given, that the educational institute is going to give you these skills to operate in a responsible way as you come out. Responsible, but also in a creative way. If that's a given, then I agree with you. Then, yes, only a person who's coming out with those particular skills should be allowed to do, to practice as an architect and to make buildings, because then you're ensuring a certain standard of buildings that then have addressed all of these particular conditions. But that's not true, and we know that through the number of schools that have proliferated. Someone did an arithmetic, and in the last decade there's been some 200 colleges or something that have been given approvals to operate as architecture colleges. So the question really is, what kind of education are these colleges imparting? What kind of role does council play in giving these educational institutions the pass to go ahead and produce architects? And how is the education of the architect being monitored, so that you ensure that sensitive individuals are being produced who are engaged and can act responsibly and creatively? That is not a given. That in our current situation, the vast majority of graduates actually are incapable of operating, in that sophisticated way, and many of them actually have to spend a number of years with an architect to learn how to conduct themselves in a professional way and work, in a responsible and creative way. So, I think the answer to your question, in an ideal world, is yes. You should be able to come out of an architecture school, do a licensing exam if there is one, and then work as an architect. And it's only it's only you're the only one licensed to do it, and no one else can. But with the sort of core missing piece of the educational, the quality of the educational institutions, with that missing, I'm not able to say that we should protect the practice yet. And so that's really the struggle. And I was just doing a quick research, and there are fantastic people who never went to architecture school who produced incredible. I mean, you can think of, people like Scarpa or Zumthor or Le Corbusier or Frank Lloyd Wright or uh, Ando, who was a boxer. I mean, these are people who never went to architecture school but have found their voice because, it was in them, and they sort of went out there and found, their expression. So, yeah, I would say that in England or in America, I mean, we've had interns from England, from Wales, from London. We've had interns from America, from nondescript colleges, not Ivy Leagues or anything. And I can fairly say that the base standard at which they operate, the questions they ask, the skills that they possess, the way that they engage with the work, there is a marked difference. And this is true within India as well, that if I take different interns that we get from different colleges, there are some colleges from where invariably the interns are equipped with a way to engage with profession. They ask the right questions. They know how to start things. So I think there is that sort of question about how we regulate and monitor education. The short answer is yes, and it's needed reformation for a very long time. But I think what's going to happen, and I'm hoping, and I just sent a mail today after having done a little bit of preparation for this evening's engagement with you guys. I'm part of the VTU, and I wrote to them saying that here's an opportunity. We are now in this incredible crisis. We are seeing, on one hand, all of the challenges of the way the power structures that exist within architecture, the architect or the project manager at the top, and this pyramid, and then down below, all of the minions who make all the buildings, who are the worst hit in this pandemic. So if I was to think about reform, this is the perfect opportunity to think of that reform, because this crisis has brought to the surface all of these inequities that exist in the way that architecture is made in the country. So this, I don't know the answer to your question specifically, but I think as part of universities across the country, we need to start thinking about how we're educating our architects so that they are aware of these power structures that exist and how they can work to destroy these sort of inequities in any way that they can. One of the things that I think, was it the IIA or some agency, has now put out or is starting to put out certain regulations on how housing is to be provided for labor at site, what kind of amenities, what kind of safety standards. I mean, how many of us are at site thinking of any of this when we go to see our projects under construction? I mean, the hidden workforce that is producing these buildings are all but invisible to us on our construction sites. And this pandemic has brought to bear, the incredible sort of inhuman conditions in which these people are living and working, and the scant regard we have for them as part of our, this sort of glorified practice of architecture. And so, yes, we need to look at our syllabus in terms of, our own social responsibilities, in terms of the impact our building has. Of course, we've been talking about environment and sustainability, but I think the social sort of angle is something that we really need to think about in terms of how things are made and produced. Isn't it obvious that these 500 schools producing 80 to 120 kids every year, and with none of them having a voice in how anything is regulated, sounds silly and just not correct at all. I mean, I don't know the structure of the COA. I don't know who sits on these sort of panels to decide things. I'm surprised to hear that there isn't student representation in these conversations. It's kind of silly. Of course, the students would need to be heard. And I think last time when we were talking about it, the notion that, the students, because your membership at NASA particularly is so widespread, you have students from all over the country who are exposed to conditions all across the country. It's the perfect platform in which to collate data that you can collect about practice, about the problems that architects face, about the problems that students face. I mean, the biggest challenge, of course, now is for a student to get an internship. I mean, a place where at least you're exposed to some basic minimum, ideas of responsibility about doing things in a certain rigorous way. How many students are getting that opportunity? And so, what is the council doing about these disparities. So they're producing all of these architects, and then what? What are the prospects? So yeah, I think I'm surprised to know that there is no voice, or that you have no engagement at all with the council. It's unfortunate. I mean, to begin with, I don't think the profession has a very high standing in society per se. I mean, so I don't know whether we can go any further down the ladder. I mean, for instance, if you just take the making of our cities, or any kind of urban design or planning or any kind of city-related development, there are very few architects who are really engaged with or even invited to the table. I mean, forget students, architects are completely out of the picture in those conversations about what is, because city making has now become about money, for the political kitties, and it's across the board. And so design and these ideas of social justice or sustainability, I don't know where the architect really stands in sort of in terms of hierarchy, or in terms of standing within society. But that said, I think what the judgment has brought to bear, which is what is nice about it, is that it has brought to bear the disconnect between the education of the architect. So all of the things that the council stipulates in terms of what you need to prepare as an architect, and the practice of architecture and who gets to practice it. And what it has brought to light is this fundamental disjoint between who is educated and who can practice. Because the Architects Act tells you that the practice is not protected, which means that you can do 5 years of architecture, come out with a degree, but you're then fighting in the market with everybody in terms of making architecture, making buildings. And so there is a challenge, and of course there's a lot of conversation about how we can fix that mismatch between the two mandates of the council. Well, I think the prime question is the question of education. And so, yes, we need an amendment to the Act. And there is a group of architects. I'm part of a group of around 300 architects with a group called Lokpat. And there's a lot of conversation on a group that, a group of architects from Delhi has formed. We are hoping to articulate three aspects of the conduct and the licensing of architecture. So the first is, of course, the education component, and what it means in terms of preparing someone for education. The second is the licensing of who is registered, who can become an architect. Do you have an exam to do that? Is it done periodically over time so that someone is always current with what the knowledge information or the knowledge systems that exist? And the third part of it is the practice or the conduct of the professional itself. How does one conduct oneself professionally? How does one, everything from fees to participating in competitions to dealing with clients to arbitration, the whole gamut of professional practice. And so, I mean, there's a whole bunch of very, very senior people on this group. I'm one amongst many. But the point of it is that there are these conversations that are going on, and hopefully there'll be some way for us to put out to the council some ideas about how we can take all three buckets and address them in sort of in substantive ways, so that we fix the problem not just in terms of protecting practice, but in terms of improving education, making licensing more rigorous, and making sure that the conduct of the architect is professional and engaged and not sort of irresponsible. So there are many components that one has to work with at once, and so that's what we're working on. I think the first thing you guys need to do is figure out a way to really have a voice on the table, or a place at the table with the council. I don't know how you do that, but you need to start making a hell of a lot of noise, so that there is some student representation, and you're able to get the word of your very large community up there with the people who are making the decisions about your education and your future. So I think that's first step that you need to figure out how to do that. And the second thing is, I mean, the NASA environment, and it has been for, I don't know, 30, 40 years now, ever since I have attended NASA and even recent NASAs that I've been to, it's a fantastic open, uh, environment for exchange. So people are there, putting their hearts out into these projects that they're preparing. They're fighting for these trophies, and it's a real sort of without any other agenda. These people are working on projects and putting out what they think is their best. So if one is to have a conversation, we had a conversation a few years ago about these modern heritage buildings that were under threat and being demolished, like Pragati Maidan, but also Kala Academy in Goa. So the question was, how do we protect these buildings? What kind of strategies can we use? And the conversation was incredible. It was incredible. It was illuminating, and students were thinking about ways in which to engage with authorities and with documenting and putting this information out there so that people would be aware of their modern heritage. So one of the jurors at the end of this whole deliberation had said that we need to package all of this stuff that the students have put together because of the value that was inherent in these presentations and disseminate this. Send it out to whoever you think is going to listen, or who's in the firing line, or who's making these decisions, so that all of these ideas and these voices are out there. And this is true now for the Architects Act as well. If there's some way for you to mobilize a forum, have an exchange with a few architects, but with a bunch of students, to discuss what the act is about and how and if the act needs to be amended, and what those strategies are, so that one can move forward. And then put this information in front of the council, put this information in front of other practicing architects, so that everybody's aware about the ramifications of the Architects Act with regards to practice and with regards to education. This isn't, I'm aware of it now only thanks to you guys prompting me to get into talking about the Architects Act. And because the judgment has come out and it's become this big, it's created this big hullabaloo. Otherwise, we were all going about our business as architects without any idea about the ramifications of the act. And so I think NASA can be the catalyst for putting together a lot of voices about the act and about the judgment. So two things, I think: engage with the council, find a way to get it placed at the table, and create some kind of a set of forums for people to discuss this issue.